All right, guys, here we go. Deck tech number 2. This time it's Breya, Ethereum Shaper. I've had a lot of requests for a deck tech for this deck. It's no surprise, actually, given how strong Breya is in both multiplayer and in the online commander format. In fact, there's a pretty valid argument that Breya is now the strongest commander overall in online Magic, 1v1 commander, due to its flexibility, the colors that it enables, the overall strength of the creature, just kind of does everything. I think it works really well in combo, so it's very effective in multiplayer. Although this deck that I'm showing off today is not, in fact, a multiplayer list. It's well, not specifically a multiplayer list, and by that I mean that it's designed to shine in 1 versus 1. It certainly does work well in multiplayer. Probably requires a sideboard of at least 5 or 6 cards different to really excel in multiplayer. There are a few cards in here that aren't all that suited for it. But the deck does work well in multiplayer, even if it is more focused as a 1 versus 1 deck. But a lot of people who play Breya in multiplayer opt to use it as a combo deck, involving a bunch of different combos, often using the Cart Clan Ironworks and some various other things to cast Breya infinite times and deal infinite damage. But this deck is much more of a grindy control deck. It can do fine in a multiplayer context, but it does require you to figure out a game plan where you're going to be able to beat everybody. And it usually involves a couple specific cards, most often actually the Winter Orb, backed up by Necropotence and the various other tools in the deck. But that said, it is extremely fun, extremely flexible. I'm going to talk about the commander herself a little bit for people who aren't very familiar with her in general. What's kind of funny, actually, is that when Breya first debuted, I actually ran into it online and made a somewhat famous and obviously very off-base statement about how I wasn't that impressed by it, and I just didn't think that the creature was all that good. But then I started playing with it some more, and it became very apparent that it was probably the best commander that's ever been built ever for a control deck because of the various abilities that it has. First of all, when she comes into play, she summons 2 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creatures. So you get 6 power creatures for just 4 mana, which is already a ridiculous bargain, and that 6 power is spread across 3 creatures, all of which are artifacts, and 2 of which have evasion, which makes it even more effective, especially because 1/1 flying blue Thopters are extremely effective for doing things like killing planeswalkers. Going on to her abilities, all 3 of them are useful, although the primary strength ability is the one in the middle. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, which you get by paying 2 generic and sacrificing 2 artifacts, which conveniently Breya comes with. And -4/-4 means that if you play Breya early, around turn 2 or turn 3, and you can very consistently cast this creature on turn 3 probably, you have the ability to basically kill your opponent's commander as soon as it resolves and continue to do other stuff. And that is incredibly effective. The ability to basically tap out to play Breya, knowing that there really aren't too many things they can answer with, even if they answer with something like Jace the Mind Sculptor, which will often come down at 4 mana, well, they would bounce Breya and you would just send over your 2 Thopters and kill Jace and continue on your merry way. So the fact that Breya brings so much board presence with her makes her quite safe to just run out on turn 3 or turn 4 against most decks, because they just don't have very many answers that you can't answer with the general herself. Additionally, the first ability, Breya deals 3 damage to target player, that has more application, especially in a multiplayer context. It has more application to playing in a multiplayer game where you're going to try to combo off and use that ability to kill everybody at the table. But in 1v1, it's extremely strong, mainly as a way to kill planeswalkers. It gives you a way to interact with enemy planeswalkers when they have blockers up, because you can just send damage to their face and redirect it over onto their creature, or over onto their planeswalker, like, for example, a Jace the Mind Sculptor or a Tezzeret or something like that. You can just blow it up. And then finally, the life gain is another excellent tool to have in a control deck. I can count probably at least maybe 20, 30 games I played in multiplayer where I was clinging to the edge of life because a number of people were attacking me, and I had Necropotence in play and various other things, and Breya's life gain ability kept me afloat and allowed me to stay in the game long enough to win. But the combination of those 3 abilities, if you were to really attach abilities to a general, and you'd be hard-pressed to make a set of abilities that would work better for a control deck. Maybe card drawing, although some people run Skull Clamp and Breya because you can just Skull Clamp away the Thopters and draw extra cards off that. I am not using Skull Clamp, and one of the reasons for that is that I find the Thopters are so valuable as sack outlets and as attackers that I just generally don't want to sack them, even if it means drawing extra cards off Skull Clamp. That may seem insane, but that's what the testing bore out. I also wanted to include a little extra caveat. This is a deck that I've been using a great deal, but it was actually co-constructed with a very good friend of mine and collaborator, Nate Prodzik, who, if you are familiar with at least YouTube-based 1v1 Commander videos, you are probably familiar with his excellent series. Go check out his channel if you haven't looked him up already. Nate Prodzik is his name, and he's a fantastic player and a great friend of mine. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the deck, having spoken about Breya. First card. Ancient Tomb. In 1v1 Commander, this is clearly the strongest land in the entire format, probably. It's probably a little weaker than, say, something like Gaia's Cradle in multiplayer, but overall it's one of the strongest lands in the entire format. It's basically a zero casting cost Sol Ring, and the damage that it deals to you is negligible. I think Ancient Tomb is a kind of auto-include in just about every single Commander deck you could ever build. Maybe there are some weird niche fringe cases where it's not that good, but overall I think this card is an auto-include. It's just way too much goodness, and the drawback with your extra life buffer, either 30 or 40 life, is quite negligible. Arid Mesa, the first of many fetch lands. This deck runs the entire suite of fetch lands. It's got all 10 of them, of course, because there's overlap between all 4 of Breya's colors. Badlands, the first of the revised series of dual lands that I have in the deck. I'm running, of course, all of the ones that overlap with Breya, just all the non-green ones, and that accounts for the shock versions as well. Second fetch land, Bloodstained Mire. City of Brass, obviously excellent, especially in a 4-color deck. The damage that it deals to is quite negligible, and the color flexibility is extremely important. Command Tower, well, obvious choice. This is an auto-include in any single Commander deck with more than 1 color in it. Flooded Strand, blue-based fetch land, that's a no-brainer. Hallowed Fountain, the Tundra equivalent, that is also fetchable. Single basic island. I'm only running 1 basic island mainly because of Ghost Quarter and I guess potentially Path to Exile. It's, you know, I mean, what can you do, right? You need at least 1 basic island in there to have it as a fetch target for those cases. I'm not running Solemn Simulacrum, but I don't feel any need to run any more than that. The deck is probably a little bit vulnerable to things like Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, and I guess back to basics to a degree, but it does have a ton of alternate artifact mana, and so it doesn't really get paralyzed. And you don't, it's kind of one of those situations where if someone's going to really screw you with Blood Moon, adding 2 or 3 or 4 basic land to your deck is probably not going to change that all that much, and I don't think it's worth the sacrifice. We do run more basic land in the 1v1 Commander deck, and the reason for that is because we use land tax, but only a single island here. Mana Confluence, basically just another City of Brass. Can't have enough of these effects. Marsh Flats, another fetch land. All right, Big Papa Mishra's Factory, most expensive, or Mishra's Workshop, sorry, most expensive land in Magic right now, I think, actually. I don't know how it competes with Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, but they're both really close. Anyway, this card is phenomenal in Breya, absolutely insane. It allows you to play multiple Signets often on turn 1, or a Talisman and a Signet. It allows you to ramp out the Gilded Lotus extremely quickly. It's fetchable with Expedition Map, and it is incredibly strong for casting the Commander too. It allows you to basically almost cast or pay for Breya's Commander tax twice. I think as far as super high-end primo cards to include in the deck, when you're building it yourself, I would put Mishra's Workshop down near the very bottom of last things to acquire. I don't think that it's necessary by any measure. It just makes a good deck better whenever you draw it. It is a super powerful tool in general, and an excellent investment choice in general for EDH as a format. But I don't think it's mandatory, and if you have other budget concerns, there's plenty of other much more important cards to get before this, like the revised dual lands and cards like Mana Drain. Mystery Rainforest, yet another blue fetch. Plateau, there's another one of the revised dual lands. That crummy revised picture. There's another fetch land, the Pluto Delta, and a Scalding Tarn. Scrubland, yet another revised dual land. Shivan Reef. I'm running this one because I felt like I didn't quite have enough red mana in the deck when I first built it, and I shuffled it around and decided to put Shivan Reef in, mainly because I obviously want as many blue sources as possible, and I did want access to extra red. This card's kind of on the bubble. There probably are some cards that you could realistically substitute for it, like maybe one of the maybe the blue-black cycling fetchable land, potentially that new one that was printed. Spire of Industry. This card I'm a little bit on the fence about. I don't actually run it in the Commander version online, but that's also because we don't have Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, or Mana Vault in that format. And I think in the presence of those three cards and the fact that you're tutoring for them so often at the start of the game, if you open the game with Vampiric Tutor, Imperial Seal, Enlightened Tutor, or Demonic Tutor, you're almost certainly getting Mana Crypt or Soul Ring at the start, and that makes Spire of Industry a lot stronger than it is in a format where you don't have access to those cards. So I'm including it for now, and I've been reasonably happy with it. All right, Steam Vents, the Volcanic Island equivalent, and obviously auto-include for more blue and red. Strip Mine, this card is phenomenally powerful even in multiplayer, and certainly extremely strong in 1v1 when combined with Crucible of Worlds. You often find yourself fetching it or tutoring for it pretty early on. But it is banned in 1 versus 1 Commander, which is actually a problem because there's a bunch of Commander cards that are there's a bunch of different Commander cards, specifically cards like let me think here, Cavern of Souls, for example. Cavern of Souls is a huge problem that looms really, really large over the 1 versus 1 Commander format. In fact, it's in pretty much every deck. And without Strip Mine, you've got 1/2 of the answers to deal with that card. And if you're playing a blue-based deck, it is super problematic. And there are a few other things. Boseiju is another really big problem. So I think that I'm kind of on the fence about the Strip Mine banning. I know why it was done in 1 versus 1. I think the primary reason is because of its interaction with life from the loam, but also obviously with Crucible of Worlds. You can do that with Wasteland to a large extent as well, and I think that getting rid of Strip Mine just gives you fewer tools to deal with particular problem lands. Then again, blue is kind of overpowered and a little bit oppressive in 1 versus 1, and both Boseiju and Cavern of Souls rein blue in a little bit. But the problem is that the blue decks use Cavern of Souls as well. So maybe if there was some sort of weird situational banning where you could say that you're allowed to play with Cavern of Souls, but only if you have no blue in your deck. That might be fair. Tundra. There's a beta Tundra right here. One of my set of 4 from back in the day. An actual set of 4 beta Tundras that I won in Ante way back in 1994, if you can believe that. And obviously has a rightful place in this deck. Underground River. I think this one is definitely an auto-include, unlike the Shivan Reef, just because blue and black are the most important colors in the deck by far, and you want access to those as much as possible, and the pain is well worth it. And on the subject of blue and black mana, here is a Beta Underground Sea that is a, auto-include in the deck too. Probably the best dual land in Magic. Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. A lot of people have asked me why this card's in the deck, and there's a few reasons for it. I have a couple colorless lands. I have the Wasteland and Strip Mine as well as the Mishra's Workshop, and if you have Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth in play, it turns those lands into more useful mana. But the primary reason why Urborg's in here is because one of the cornerstones of the deck is the enchantment Necropotence, and Necropotence costs black, 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 and can be very, very tricky to cast, especially because I'm not playing any of the filter lands that produce 2 black mana. But getting Urborg allows you to just instantly play Necro with impunity, and I think that fact alone, and the fact that that card is so instrumental to how this deck works, that Urborg is worth it. Verdant Catacombs. Awesome, cool-looking fetch land. I think that might be the last one. Maybe not. I guess there's Wooded Foothills to go. Another old beta dual land, Volcanic Island from my old Type 1 deck. Nothing much too much to say about this. You can tell it's beta, because there was no such thing as an alpha Volcanic Island. They screwed up and never printed them. All right, Wasteland, the counterpart to Strip Mine, and still legal in 1 versus 1 Commander. And just all-around utility card, still good enough to include in multiplayer. You definitely want it in 1v1. You want it as often as possible, especially because when combined with Crucible of Worlds, you can lock someone out of the game really quickly and win. The Underground Sea equivalent, Watery Grave, auto-include. Aha, there's one of 2 fetch lands left. There's Windswept Heath, which of course gets plains, doesn't get forests, and Wooded Foothills, which gets mountains, so you can get Volcanic Island with it and Badlands and so on. All right, that is all the land, and I believe that is 31. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 6, 7, 8, 9, 31. Yeah, it's 31. So 31 may seem like very little land, but when you consider the fact that the deck has a bunch of cheap artifacts to play, as well as a bunch of cheap searching. You're very frequently keeping one land draws where you have cards like Tithe, or Imperial Seal, or Vampiric Tutor, or you have Ponder, or Preordain, or Brainstorm. There's so many different ways that you can utilize a low mana draw and develop quickly anyway without skipping a beat that it's, I think, a safe mana point. Plus, mulligans are much more generous in multiplayer anyway because you have the ability to mulligan once for free. And I think that alone means that playing with all the extra spells is worth the risk. Okay, moving on to artifacts. Or actually, I guess zero cost and cost things. Mana Crypt, the most powerful card in all of EDH. There it is right there. Extremely negligible drawback. It does an average of 1.5 damage to you per turn. Actually, it does even less than that. In fact, it does 1.5 to you normally per turn, but when you consider the fact that you have double the life in Commander, this card does less than 1 point of damage to you, balanced against a 20 life total. And that exchange for a 0 mana Soul Ring is pretty much worth it. I would say I tutor for Mana Crypt at the beginning of the game, I don't know, at least 85% of the time off my first tutor. The card is just so powerful. And even in situations, honestly, where you feel like, okay, well, I can just play my Soul Ring next turn if I tutor for it right now, it's almost always correct to tutor for Mana Crypt anyway, because the flexibility of the card gives you the fact that it's almost impossible for your opponent to counterspell it in any efficient manner, and the fact you have to invest nothing in it, and it gives you extra mana to play around things like force spike abilities and Condescend and Mana Leak and Miscalculation and so on. That extra flexibility is usually worth it. The only time you would not want to get this over Soul Ring is if you were planning on playing it on that turn and you had extra mana left over, or if you were really, really concerned about your life total for some reason. But overall, Mana Crypt is probably the most, well, actually, unequivocally the most powerful card in all of Commander, and I think it's kind of a card that you should absolutely acquire as soon as you start to build your collection. Mox Diamond, very, very powerful. Even with 31 land, this card's so fantastic because it just, the ability to color fix so quickly and enable 2 mana starts to start casting signets and things like that talismans actually is really, really strong. I think Mox Diamond is an auto-include in nearly every single deck in Commander, and certainly in 1v1 Commander. It is one of the best cards. In fact, this card is kind of the Soul Ring of 1v1 Commander. It's that strong. All right, Mox Opal. This card is at its very, very best in Breya, probably out of all the decks in the format, mainly because Breya has so many artifacts, and because Mox Opal is a Metalcraft card, it's just, the moment you cast Breya, you've just got Metalcraft automatically turned on. And that fact alone, the fact that it's fetchable with Tezzeret the Seeker and with Trinket Mage to get extra colored mana is extremely strong, and a huge fan of the card. I think that it belongs in, I think it actually belongs in a fair amount of decks that people don't use it in, but certainly if your deck has upwards of 20 artifacts, Mox Opal, I think, is an auto-include. All right, moving on to the ones. Brainstorm. Well, one of the most powerful cards ever created, really. I mean, it's an honest, reasonable substitute for Ancestral Recall in most formats, and certainly in a deck that has 10 fetch lands and a million other reshuffling abilities. The card Brainstorm is extremely strong, allows you to keep questionable, dubious draws, and unfortunately the card's been banned in 1v1 Commander, which is kind of a blow to blue decks. I understand why it was done, because it was an auto-include, and it probably made decks, blue-based decks, stronger than they needed to be when they were already over OP. But yeah, the card's just awesome. I tutor for this card all the time, actually, with both Merchant Scroll and often with Mystical Tutor, too. It's just that good. Enlightened Tutor, the first of the tutors in the deck. I love this card in this particular deck. There are so many excellent Silver Bullet style effects that you want to fetch with Enlightened Tutor. I would say foremost, obviously, you're going to get Soul Ring and Mana Crypt with it, but it also fetches, of course, Necropotence. It gets Gilded Lotus when you need that. It gets Future Sight. It gets Sensei's Divining Top sometimes. It can, and it can often get Veldican Shackles or Crucible of Worlds to set up a Strip Mine lock. The flexibility of the card is just unparalleled in most Commander decks with white, and especially in the Breya deck. Auto-include for sure. And Imperial Seal, the fixed Vampiric Tutor that costs, I don't know, roughly 30 times as much as Vampiric Tutor. You notice this is a white border one. I actually went and decided I had to get the card for Commander before they decided to reprint it as a Judge's Foil. So this is one from Portal 3 Kingdoms, I think. Yeah, it says 1999 down there. That's the first time that the card was printed. But yeah, I mean, it just does everything that Vampiric Tutor does, except that it's at sorcery speed, and that is entirely acceptable. The only time the only time it's really bad is when you need a card right away and you draw the Imperial Seal. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's really, It's just an issue of timing, I suppose. The fact that you can hold off on casting Vampiric Tutor until you've seen what your opponent is about to do, and then adapt to whatever the board state is at the end of their turn, versus Imperial Seal, where you have to be a little bit more proactive. But the cards are so close in power level that they're nearly interchangeable. And certainly Imperial Seal is definitely one of those primo cards that is well worth picking up. And thankfully, the Judge's Foil is a lot cheaper than the White Rorder version. I think it's like in the $200 range or something like that. Don't ask me what I paid for this one. Yuck. All right, Mana Vault. Super awesome card, banned in 1v1 Commander for obvious reasons. It enables grotesque starts, especially if you draw something like Gilded Lotus early on or Thran Dynamo. It does have that drawback where you take damage, but one thing to consider is that this deck has Necropotence in play all the time, and because of the way that Mana Vault works, you actually don't take damage from your an untapped Mana Vault if you have Necro in play. It's really strange. I think it's because you wouldn't see it on this card because this is a revised edition one, but the current version of Mana Vault, at least online, prevents you from taking damage if you do not untap it, if you have Necro out, which is kind of a cool little benefit. But obviously fantastic, and after you've used the mana, you can just sacrifice it to Breya and just move on. Mystical Tutor, yet another one of the toolbox enabler cards in the deck. Probably the most common target for Mystical Tutor is the Toxic Deluge, or maybe the Rolling Earthquake as well. But it does get Swords to Plowshares, it does get card drawing, it does get Demonic Tutor, which allows you to fetch any card in the deck in a chain. Just incredible flexibility, overall amazing card, and another one of those blue cards I consider an auto-include in the format. Ponder, fantastic blue filter card, one of the cards that allows you to keep a much wider range of opening draws, and for that very reason this card was banned recently in 1v1 Commander. And again, it makes sense. Weakening blue makes sense in a format where blue is totally dominant. It's a little inconvenient, but there are substitutions in that format if you really still want that effect, although I've stopped playing all of them entirely and just gone with playing more lands and more mana in general. But Ponder's great. And its little buddy Preordain, which is a very, very similar effect, actually. They're nearly interchangeable and does exactly the same thing. These two are both auto-includes. Sensei's Divining Top. This card is a powerhouse and banned in 1v1 Commander right now, although I don't agree with that banning because it was done mainly for a time consideration rather than for a power level consideration. That said, the card is super, super strong in multiplayer, and it's particularly good in this Breya deck because of how many reshuffle effects you have. And of course, don't forget about the ultimate Living the Dream trick with Sensei's Divining Top and Future Sight, which I will get to as soon as I arrive at that enchantment later on. Sol Ring, second most powerful card in all of EDH. It is basically just Mana Crypt with 1 mana attached to it, which makes it a lot weaker, actually, surprisingly weaker, especially because there's things that counterspell 1 mana cards, like Mental Misstep, for example. And but that said, a draw with Sol Ring early on in the game puts you so far ahead of your opponent that it's nearly impossible for them to catch up. And I completely, of course, agree with the bannings of both Mana Crypt and Sol Ring from 1v1 Commander, because you can't have a serious viable format where one person just gets a completely ridiculous advantage on the strength of having drawn 1 card in their deck right at the start. And in 1v1 or in multiplayer, people tend to gang up on you if you go too fast, but this Breya deck is so strong and resilient that if you draw Sol Ring, you can generally just kick everyone's ass anyway. Swords to Plowshares, obvious card in pretty much any deck with white in it in the format. It is the best single removal spell ever printed, and the life you give to your opponent is completely negligible. Swords is completely amazing and has been for 24 years. Tithe. I love this card in this deck. This card is so good. The flexibility, the ability to go and get multiple planes for just a single white mana at instant speed is incredible. It allows you to just keep so many hands that otherwise would be unplayable. And of course, there's an extremely powerful and potent interaction between Tithe and all the sack lands, as well as both Wasteland and Strip Mine. If you lead with a white mana source, like let's say you open up with a Tundra, and your second play is one of the fetch lands, or it's a Wasteland or Strip Mine, and your opponent plays their second land, at the end of their turn, what you do is you just simply sacrifice the fetch land, or sacrifice the Wasteland or Strip Mine targeting one of their lands. And with the sacrifice on the stack, or I should say the ability of the sacrifice on the stack, because the sacrifice resolves immediately, you cast Tithe. And when Tithe looks down at the battlefield, it sees that you only have 1 land versus 2 of your opponents. So you get to fetch 2 lands out of your deck, then those go into your hand, and then the effect resolves, giving you your second land. So you effectively cheat around the fact that you hit 2 land drops in a row. And that combined with Ty's overall flexibility makes it one of the best cards for mana fixing in the entire format if you have access to white. Vampiric Tutor, super powerhouse card, just a better version of Imperial Seal because you can cast it at instant speed. This card is an absolutely mandatory auto-include in every single deck with black in the format. Never ever do not put Vampiric Tutor in your deck. You will regret it. All right, Vandal Blast. In my opinion, the strongest artifact removal spell ever printed. Nate has become a big fan of the card by force, and he's been using it in 1v1 Commander along with Vandal Blast because with the rise of Breya after the banning of Vial Smasher, artifacts have become a lot more ubiquitous. Before, there was no reason to play either Vandal Blast or by force, and now there's certainly justification to play with both of them. By force is kind of, it's a little bit better in that middle spot when you're casting it for maybe 3 mana, maybe 4 mana. It's a little bit better. Certainly at the 3 mana point, it's better than Vandal Blast because killing 2 artifacts for 3 mana is basically rack and ruin, and that's pretty damn strong. But the fact that Vandal Blast doesn't care about targeting and it hits everything in play, the entire board for just 5, is super potent. And I love the fact, especially in multiplayer format where you're dealing with turn 1 Crypt and Soul Ring, the fact that Vandal Blast costs 1 red mana. Because often if your opponent goes land Soul Ring and you go, well, I've got by force in my hand, I'm going to play a land here and say done. And then on their next turn they play something for 4 mana, well, you've probably already lost the game right there, unless both those cards are artifacts, because you're just going to be too far behind. But when you've got Vandal Blast, you just blow the Soul Ring up or the Mana Crypt up and you just move on. Such a wonderful card. Best red card in Commander. Weathered Wayfarer. I was actually on the fence about this guy initially when Nate first proposed using it, but having played with it a bunch of times, I am a convert. Weathered Wayfarer is absolutely ridiculous. It's basically Tithe in creature form and can even do even more crazy degenerate things, especially in 1v1 Commander where we're actually playing with 3 of the bounce lands from Ravnica. We're playing with Izzet Boilerworks, Dimmer Aqueduct, and Azorius Chancery. And you can do crazy things with Weathered Wayfarer with those lands because you can fetch one of them, play that land, and you basically develop your mana without increasing your land in play count. But additionally, Weathered Wayfarer does all of the same things that Tide does with regards to fetch lands, and you can often have 2 or 3 turns in a row where you fetch land with Weathered Wayfarer while developing your mana off the fetch land by using the Wayfarer's ability in response to the sacrifice of the land. It also does that with Strip Mine and Wasteland, and of course Weathered Wayfarer fetches Strip Mine and Wasteland, so it combines extremely well with the Crucible of Worlds, prevents you from getting mana screwed. It is so much power for just a single white mana and the investment of 1 creature. Can't say enough good things about this guy. If you have not used him before, try him out. You will not be disappointed. And of course the ability is even better in multiplayer because it's so much more likely that someone will have more lands than you in that format. All right, that is all the ones. Let's go on to Copy Artifact. I don't really think this card is worthwhile using in 1v1 Commander because in the absence of Crypt and Soul Ring, there just aren't enough early artifacts that are probably worth the risk of playing with an enchantment that's a little bit inflexible. But in multiplayer, where there's 3 other chances for your opponents to have both Crypt and Soul Ring, Copy Artifact really shines. It's super, super strong, and of course, the ability to double up on cards like Gilded Lotus or Veldican Shackles is often decisive. And in a pinch, you can do things also like copy Breya if you really need Thopters or something too. You can just make a copy of Breya, get the Thopters, and then Breya, of course, will die on the stack. Actually, I wonder if you can. Yeah, I guess it dies as a state-based effect, so you can't sack the copy artifact if there's another Breya in play, but you still get the Thopters, and that can actually be quite impactful. The card is excellent and flexible and allows you to come back in games where your opponent gets a fast start by piggybacking on their artifacts. And you can transmute for it with Muddle the Mixture, which is great. Generic old counterspell, one of the best counterspells ever printed, of course, and an auto-include in every blue deck. Not too much to say about that. Cyclonic Rift. This is a card that we are no longer using in 1v1 Commander because the opportunities to use it to devastating effect are few and far in between. But of course in multiplayer and in this sort of larger, more mana-rampy 1v1 format where you have access to everything in paper, Cyclonic Rift is often backbreaking and especially insane when combined with either Mind Twist or Winter Orb. You can often just win games out of nowhere against an entire group table full of people by just casting a timely Cyclonic Rift and then playing Winter Orb, and they all kind of sit there and grumble and lose. Great card. Dark Confidant. This guy is awesome. You would think that with a fair amount of 4 and 5 mana spells in the deck that he might be too dangerous to use, but if you actually look at the mana curve of this deck, I'm just in the 2s right now, and if you see right there, that's roughly over half the deck at the 2 mana point and below, and I actually am not done with the 2s yet. I would say that the average converted mana cost of a card in this deck is below 2 for sure, probably closer to 1. And that means that the average damage that Dark Confidant is going to do to you is only 1 to 1.5 points per turn, and that is easily worth it to draw an extra card every single turn. Or actually, it's not even drawing it, it's putting it into your hand, so it circumvents things as well, things that constrain drawing extra cards. And on top of that, he's a 2/1 for 2 mana, which is great, and he can wield equipment. Dark Confidant, super, super amazing, strong black card. Should probably be in just about every deck with black in Commander. The best of all the tutors, the original OG, the Demonic Tutor. Not too much else to say about him, but one thing is with Breya, because there are so many situational cards in the deck and so many kind of answers, one thing to always consider is you can always tell how well you're playing and how well you know the deck because you'll have the card in mind the moment you cast Demonic Tutor. Basically, a lot of people cast Demonic Tutor or a similar tutor, and they'll kind of be sorting through their deck, looking at stuff, trying to figure out exactly what they should get. But if you're really familiar with the deck, you'll know exactly what you want, even probably before you draw a Demonic Tutor, because you'll have some cards in mind thinking, okay, well, if I draw this particular thing, I'm going to do this. So if you draw a Demonic Tutor, well, instantly that's a copy of the card that you wanted, and you can go get it right away. Disenchant. We just added this back into the deck again. I think that there's a bunch of other things that kind of do this effect in Commander format. There's Hide Seek, for example, and Wear and Tear and a few other things. And I think that just the simplicity of Disenchant, the fact that this ability, this effect, is so important at the very beginning of the game that playing with a card that the deck has a ton of white mana in it, obviously, and playing with a card that requires you to have a specific color in play outside of white is a little bit dubious given how often you want to be able to just cast Disenchant on the very first turn of the game or on turn 2 to deal with something like the Crypt of the Sol Ring. And that fact alone has made me comfortable with using Disenchant over one of the more flexible choices. Of course, it's totally reasonable to use Wear and Tear or Hide Seek if you really want to, and if you're playing in a different group of people where things are a little bit slower, that may make perfect sense. But for now, I'm just going to go with the raw simplicity and flexibility of Disenchant. All right, Felwar Stone, awesome mana-fixing card. Very frequently will make all 5 colors of mana in multiplayer, and is particularly useful too because when you steal something from your opponent using the Veldican Shackles, you will often be able to activate their creature even if it has an unusual color in the activation cost, like potentially green or something. Felwar Stone will allow you to do that. Grim Monolith. This is probably the most powerful accelerator left in 1v1 Commander, and it's actually not even played by very many people, although I tend to use it in most of my decks because I use Tezzeret the Seeker in so many of them as well. And Grim Monolith is just a slightly fixed version of Mana Vault, but still very, very, very powerful, and the ability to untap it at any time is excellent, especially when you're using it to bring out something like a Thran Dynamo or something similar. Moving on. Impulse. Old card from Visions. It's another card you don't see people play too often, but I'm a really huge fan of it. I think that the 2 mana is a little high for a card that is primarily designed to just tune your hand. But that said, being able to look 4 cards down for something, and it's usually mana, is really, really strong, especially at instant speed. And of course, don't worry about the bottom of what this card says. You don't actually shuffle your library afterwards. All right. The king of all counters, Mana Drain. I talked about this a lot in my Nin Deck Tech video, and a few of the points I think bear repeating. Mana Drain is the single most powerful counterspell ever printed. People may try to make that claim about Force of Will, and while Force of Will is very powerful and is sort of format warping and defining, it occupies a very particular niche in Magic. Mana Drain is unparalleled in terms of raw power. If you tutor for this card early off of either Merchant Scroll or Mystical Tutor, or Demonic Tutor, and especially off the first 2 because it requires you to reveal the card, your opponent has to completely change the way that they play the game from that point onward, and that is not the case with Force of Will. With Force of Will, there are situations where you expect that your opponent might have it, and you have to take that into account if you're making some huge investment in something that's going to be utterly decisive for whether or not you win the game. But Mana Drain, if your opponent's holding Mana Drain, you have to be careful about what you play at 2 or even 3 mana, because your opponent may answer back with something completely devastating, like, for example, a Mind Twist for your entire hand, or a big high casting cost Planeswalker, which can defend itself. And I think that the presence of planeswalkers in the format makes mana drain way, way more deadly, because imagine it's turn 2, I have 2 mana in play, my opponent plays their second mana and casts something for 2 mana. I mana drain it and I untap and I cast Tezzeret the Seeker. My opponent has nothing in play but 2 land. They have no way to interact with the planeswalker, and Tezzeret will very quickly just run away with the game because it'll just be generating extra mana every turn, either by fetching it or by untapping it. And the board state will get out of control, and I can go and fetch Veldic and Shackles and various other things. And Mana Drain can enable all sorts of crazy starts like that. It's so insanely strong. I can't say enough things about this card. And I think that if you're interested in playing competitive blue decks in Commander, in multiplayer Commander, get yourself a Mana Drain. There's Italian versions that cost only around $100, and I think that's well worth the investment, given how strong and enabling this card is. And of course, unfortunately, it's been banned in 1v1 Commander, which of course makes perfect sense. Mana Leak. This is a card that's probably a little bit on the fence if you're playing a lot of multiplayer. There's probably better choices at 2 mana if you really, if that's the main format you play. Of course, it's excellent in 1v1 because if you draw it at the beginning of the game, you can probably hard counter nearly anything up until about turn 6 or turn 7, unless they draw a Crypto or a Soul Ring. And that flexibility alone makes Mana Leak quite worth it. If you are playing multiplayer, you could certainly sideboard Mana Leak out for something a little bit more resilient, like maybe Dismiss or Mystic Confluence or something like that. Just a more expensive card that kind of serves the function of a counter, but it can also have other abilities attached. Merchant Scroll, the strongest card in Homelands. I was actually talking with someone a couple days ago about how Merchant Scroll, that Homelands really had 2 cards in it, and they were both blue, and they both cost 1 and 1 blue. But Merchant Scroll is clearly the best of all of them. This card allows you to fetch Mana Drain. That's probably your primary target. It allows you to get Muddle the Mixture, which you can transmute to go get other things, which is a really neat interaction. You can also Merchant Scroll for Mystical Tutor and use Mystical Tutor to fetch any sorcery in the deck. And you can also Merchant Scroll for Mystical Teachings, which is another common thing you do in mid-game, because that's like getting 2 instants of any color for just 2 mana. The flexibility is great. This is just another all-purpose good tutor in the deck. Muddle the Mixture. I love this counterspell. Obviously, it has the ability to counterspell instants and sorceries at a very compact cost, and that does come into play all the time, especially when you're fighting counter wars. But that transmutability is amazing. It allows you to get things like Merchant Scroll. It gets Demonic Tutor. It gets mana in a pinch. And of course, it gets the 3rd most powerful card in all of Commander, which is a few cards down. See if you can guess what it is. I'll give you a hint. It starts with the letter W. Night's Whisper. Another card that you could probably do without. This one is also kind of on the bubble. I like the effect. I think it's so compact. It's really nice to draw this card early, especially when you go first, and just play it as a turn 2 play to get your hand size back up to 7. It also makes you a little more resilient to mulligans, and of course the life loss is negligible, and that's probably enough to make it worth it. But if you're playing multiplayer, if you're playing 1v1 command, a lot of people go with the card Painful Truths instead, because it's one extra mana, but it is 3 cards for 1, and that increase in hand size is often pretty decisive. But I'm going to go with Night's Whisper for now. It can also be fetched with Muddle the Mixture if you need it to be. Remand, fantastic counterspell, and never forget the fact that you can remand your own stuff. In fact, I do that constantly. Not so much when I play my own things, but in response to your opponent trying to counterspell something you do. So for example, you cast Veldic and Shackles, your opponent pays 3 mana to dissolve your Veldic and Shackles, and you just remand the Veldic and Shackles back to your hand, which means your opponent's dissolve fizzles, they don't get to scry, you get to draw a card, and the Shackles pops back into your hand. So it's actual card advantage as well. And that little neat trick is one of the reasons why Remand's amazing, but it's also just tempo card. It allows you to keep low mana hands because you can remand early and draw extra cards and hit your land drops to keep up. Snapcaster Mage. Super, super strong, flexible guy, running this in both multiplayer and in 1v1. I didn't actually have this guy in, I think I was using him in 1v1 until more recently, but there's just so many situations where the ability to recycle an instant or sorcery from the graveyard is incredible. And it's almost always a counterspell, but it can be other things as well. And the fact that he carries equipment and stuff makes him more than worth it. Speaking of equipment, I've got Stoneforge Mystic in here, and he's in here specifically to wield 2 pieces of equipment. The first of them is Umezawa's Jitte, and the other one is the Sword of Feast and Famine, which is the only sword that the deck is currently running. And Sword of Feast and Famine in addition to giving the best colors of protection, is an incredibly powerful tool for disruption because knocking cards out of your opponent's hand is incredibly strong, and the fact that it generates enormous amounts of mana and also gives you immunity to your own Winter Orb. And the ability to fetch that with Stoneforge Mystic is incredible. Plus, the fact that you can just play Stoneforge Mystic on turn 2 and often put so much pressure on your opponent with the sword or with Umezawa's Jitte that you can just get so far ahead in the game that they can't come back. And the flexibility of the card and the fact that it's just another tutor to decrease variance is excellent. Look at this. Look how many cards I've gone through and I'm still in 2s. You can see how cheap the deck is. Talisman of Dominance. Not running any signets in the deck, although we run them in 1v1 Commander because we have fewer good artifact choices. But the talismans, I think, are clearly better than the signets because they make mana when they come into play. See, they make 1 colorless mana right there, or 1 blue or black the turn they come out. And that is often extremely important because you'll do things like play a talisman on turn 2 and then immediately cast a Ponder or a Preordain or a Vampiric Tutor or something like that. And I've got both the blue-black and the blue-white one. No signets. Umezawa's Jitte, the insane, broken, degenerate equipment card. Actually, I'm gonna relate a cool story for people who might be interested about this. A lot of people wonder how Umezawa's Jitte made it to print, given the fact that it was so obviously degenerate and broken in every format that it appeared in, and was eventually banned, I think, from Standard for good reason. And the truth of the matter is that Umezawa's Jitte was actually different in development, and in fact almost went to printing with a completely different third ability. So the first ability, equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, was on the card. And the ability, you gain 2 life by removing a counter, was on the card. And the casting cost and the equip cost were the same, but the third ability, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, was originally remove a counter to add 1 black mana to your mana pool. And that was in theme with the whole Umezawa thing, right? Because Umezawa is a black character from the game's lore, and from Kamigawa's lore. And at the very last second, for whatever reason, people in R&D got scared about the idea that you could make inordinate amounts of black mana with Umezawa's Jitte. So they looked around at the very last second for an ability that seemed like it was kind of black in theme, and they touched on target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Yeah, oops. And that's hilarious too, because by far the most powerful ability of this card is that third ability, that -1/-1 until end of turn. It is ridiculous. It allows you to remove regenerators, it allows you to make your creatures bigger than your opponents, it allows you to kill everything they have in play and all their mana dorks and kill their commander repeatedly, and it just kind of does everything. And that was all just tacked on at the last second, just as an oversight. It's actually extremely similar to what happened with the card Skull Clamp, where the ability to remove the toughness from the creature was added at the very last second too in an effort to balance it. Nice job. Boom. The bear, the polar bear of death, the Winter Orb. This card, number 3 most powerful card in all of Commander. This card brings an entire table of players to its knees. Consider the fact that for 2 mana, this card often says pretty much destroy every opponent every land your opponents control. That's really what it does in some situations. You'll have games where you've got 3 people in play and one guy's got 7 tap land and one guy's got 8 tap land and another guy's got 6 tap land. You pay 2 mana and all of their lands are effectively destroyed. It is so ridiculous, and of course all your lands are untapped. The Orb is so ridiculously powerful. It's one of the reasons why Muddle is so good. It's one of the reasons why Tezzeret the Seeker is so good, why Enlightened Tutor is so good. You tutor for this card all the time. Always be on the lookout for an opportunity to play it, especially when you can cast it off the back of Tezzeret the Seeker. So for example, end of turn, your opponent taps out, you've got 5 mana or 4 mana, you go end of turn Vampiric Tutor, get Tezzeret the Seeker, untap, play a 5th land, play Tezzeret, and immediately fetch Winter Orb. And even though all your lands are tapped, all theirs are tapped too, and they're not doing anything. And meanwhile, your Tezzeret's going to start tutoring up Soul Rings and Mana Crypts and going berserk, and you'll be able to crush them without any effort at all. I can say that almost every single game that I play and win in multiplayer involves Winter Orb just sitting in play, kind of crushing all my opponents at once. And the only chance that they have is somehow managing to destroy it. And there have been plenty of games too where I've specifically tutored for copy artifact and made a copy of Winter Orb just to ensure that the card stayed in play. So delicious, even though some people consider this card unsportsmanlike, but whatever. All right, that's all the 0s, 1s, and 2s, and look how few cards are left. That gives you a sense of just how low the mana curve in the deck really is. Chromatic Lantern. This is another card that a little bit on the fence about. You could certainly make an argument for not including it, but I really love the fact that it's such excellent color fixing, the fact that you can play it off of Mishra's Workshop. I think that if you don't have Workshop in your deck, the value of Chromatic Lantern goes down a great deal, because Workshop into Chromatic Lantern is such a bomb play because you get basically 2 mana because the Chromatic Lantern turns the Workshop into a City of Brass that doesn't hurt you. And it helps you cast all of the double blue spells in the deck, the triple blue spells in the deck, as well as, of course, Necropotence. And we don't use it in 1v1 Commander because there just are better mana sources to choose from. And it's harder to cast it, and it just doesn't do quite enough. But I think in multiplayer, it's well worth using. Coalition Relic. It's sort of the counterpart to the Chromatic Lantern, and I think clearly more powerful because it makes 2 mana over 2 turns versus just 1. That ability to charge is fantastic because you can play it on turn 3 and then untap and have 5 mana available, which is, I don't know, I mean, I guess you can have 6 mana available if you play a land. And so the acceleration from that makes it akin to Sol Ring, and the fact that it gives you 2 different colors of mana makes it really, really good for casting Breya as well. I love Coalition Relic and often copy it as well. Crucible of Worlds, phenomenal card, especially in a deck with a total of 12 sackable lands, the 10 fetches, both Wasteland and Strip Mine. Always be on the lookout for opportunities to get Crucible, to exploit it. You often just want to play it early off a Grim Monolith or a Mana Vault if you've drawn a fetch land, because you'll be able to hit every single land drop every turn and effectively draw an extra card every turn off the Crucible. And then at any point in time, if you hit the tutoring effects, I guess I'm not running Expedition Map in this version. We're running it in the 1v1 Commander version, because getting Wasteland is so important. But always be on the lookout if you are playing with Expedition Map also for a way to tutor chain into the Expedition Map to fetch a Strip Mine or Wasteland and then unleash the Crucible on your opponent and kill them with it. Such a good card. Dak Faden, incredibly strong 3-mana Planeswalker. This guy is certainly, it's probably the best blue-red card in the entire format, I think, actually. Probably the best blue-red card in all of Magic. He is so strong. The second ability in particular, the Steel Artifact ability, is amazing. And the +1 ability is completely insane, too. That is so much value for just 3 mana. The ability to throw away superfluous lands and situational Silver Bullet type cards to draw 2 extra cards a turn. So ridiculous. And the emblem is next to useless unless your deck is specifically designed to use it. There have been a few situations, mainly using the card Fire Ice, where I've been able to steal a couple of cool permanents from my opponent. But most of the time, you're never going to even consider that. You're just going to continuously draw cards and steal artifacts from your opponent. And there are plenty of great choices for that. You can just win games on the spot often with Dak Faden by stealing an early Crypt or Sol Ring that your opponent has tutored for, or something like that. He's just so good. And Duretti, Ingenious Iconoclast, printed quite recently, actually. And the first time I played against this guy, played by a friend of mine, I could not believe that it existed. I just had to read it multiple times. Like, really? This thing costs only 3 mana? It's 3 loyalty and it has these abilities? This guy's insane. He utterly dominates the battlefield. Your opponent, depending on their deck, your opponent can be completely helpless against it, just all by itself. The fact that it makes 1/1 defenders, 1/1 construct artifacts, helps with Metalcraft, gives you sack outlets to Breya. It's just totally insane for 3 mana. And, of course, the ability to sack any artifact to destroy target creature artifact. So even if you haven't had time to build up the little constructs, you can often sack Breya Thopter tokens to terror things or to shatter. So ridiculous. And his ultimate is insane, too, unlike Dax. His ultimate is completely ridiculous, too. In fact, I've had games where I put 3 Gilded Lotuses into play off Duretti, or I've put 3 Veldican Shackles into play. Totally, totally nuts. 3 Divining Tops in one game, actually, or 3 Coalition Relics. He's just absolutely insane. And I think, certainly, I think it's the best black-red card ever printed in Magic. I can't think of really any card that compares to this one. It's just that good, and so good in Commander. Fabricate is in here primarily as a way to get Crypt and Sol Ring, because it almost pays for itself when you tutor for one of those cards. But in a pinch, you can also get the Veldican Shackles. You can get Lotus in late game. I certainly have tutored for Divining Top a fair share of times. And when you're playing with, if you've got a Strip Mine in the graveyard, of course, you can Fabricate for Crucible of Worlds and lock your opponent out of the game that way. The card's amazingly flexible and well worth the 3 mana cost with this slightly narrow fetching ability. Forbid, one of the most powerful counterspells in the format, and certainly an incredibly strong tool in this deck, primarily because of its synergy with Necropotence. If you're able to engineer a situation where you have Necropotence and Forbid, your opponent is absolutely screwed, because they're never ever going to be able to break through the buyback cost. You're going to have a steady flow of cards to feed it, and once you've got a fair amount of blue mana in play, you can counter even twice a turn with buyback, and there's just no getting through that. The card's excellent, but don't be afraid to play it early on. If you need to, don't be afraid to just hard cast it at 3. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But be on the lookout for when you can buy it back safely. But don't be too aggressive with the buyback. If you throw away lands and stuff to hold forbid, you can actually do yourself a disservice and wind up running into problems down the road when you miss land drops and stuff. The Skull, the Mighty Skull. The last time I did a deck tech, I talked about this card, I think, but I didn't get to actually show it to you. Yeah, Necropotence is just simply the strongest black card ever printed. It is so ridiculous and even more disgusting and degenerate in multiplayer where you have access to 40 life. And there are actually a number of people who are a little unclear about exactly how the card functions. It's possible some of you guys may be watching the video, so I'll go into it real quick. Basically, you play Necropotence, you no longer have a draw step, so you won't draw any cards anymore through the regular draw mechanism. But you can pay 0 colorless mana whenever you want, as many times as you want, to set aside the top card of your library, which means you basically just put it off to the side, effectively in exile. And then, as a triggered ability, at the start of your next end step, that is on your turn, not on your opponent's turns, all the cards that you set aside are put into your hand. They're not drawn. And once you put those cards into your hand, there's still time during the end step to play some of them if you've drawn instants like tutors, for example, like instant speed tutors. At the end of the end step, of course, you do have to discard down to 7, and Necropotence makes you exile any of the cards that you discard for any reason from the game, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but it's not generally a particularly big deal. And that said, the fact that you can play Necro and go from a 0-card hand to a 14-card hand right away and fine-tune and sculpt your hand to deal with exactly what the board state makes the card ridiculous. There's 2 cards in particular in Commander that it combines really well with. One of them is Thought Vessel, which was printed a little while ago, maybe a little over a year ago, and the card Reliquary Tower. And both of those cards give you unlimited hand size for basically no cost, or relatively modest cost, which is ridiculous with Necropotence because you can draw 15 or 20 or 25 extra cards and keep all of them. Yes, total madness. Necropotence is probably, I would say it's probably my favorite card in all of Magic, actually. It's probably either Mana Drain or Necro, but I think Necro has served me so well over the years as a former pro player and stuff, and qualifiers and regional tournaments and all sorts of things. I love the card. I love how it feels. I love getting it into play and really milking it to the maximum. And if you do play Necro, generally it's correct to over Necro to a degree. Get a sense of how many cards you're likely to feel comfortable throwing away and how many lands you're likely to pick up off of the cards you draw from Necropotence. So for example, if you have 2 cards in hand, you play Necro, a decent, and this is assuming you have no lands in play, a decent amount of cards to Necro for would probably be in the range of 7 to 8. So that would increase your hand size up to 9 or 10, assuming that you're going to draw probably at least 2 or 3 lands, because you can only play 1 land a turn, so all the extra lands you draw are irrelevant. You just want to dig for good spells. So Necro up to the point where you're going to be able to throw away lands and keep at least 1 land in your hand, sculpt your hand from there. And of course, Necropotence also enables crazy combos, so it's even better in the combo versions of Breya. But I would say that nearly every game I play with this deck in multiplayer ends in my favor, I should say at least, ends with both Necropotence and Winter Orb in play. They're kind of diametrically opposed to each other, but because of sort of feast and famine and the way that all the artifact resources work, they do actually work really well in concert. Love this card, Necro. So good. Stoic Rebuttal. It seems kind of like a mediocre, humble counterspell, but Metalcraft is really, really relevant in Breya. And I would say a sizable portion of the time, Stoic Rebuttal is basically just counterspell for that, for UU. And yeah, that makes it worth including over the similar good options like Dissolve and Disallow and so on. They printed a lot of really good 3-mana counters lately at this exact casting cost, but I still think Stoic Rebuttal is the best choice for the Breya deck and for decks that have a fair amount of artifacts. I think if you're not running a ton of artifacts, the best choice is probably Dissolve right now, the one that gives you Scrying, because Scrying is just such an incredibly powerful ability. Disallow is also really good, especially in 1v1 commander formats where people are have a fair amount of triggered abilities, things that you might actually need to stifle. Sword of Feast and Famine. This is the other equipment I'm running in the deck, and I've already talked at length about why it's so good. Amazing protection and incredibly good synergy with Winter Orb, and of course, the ability to force your opponent to discard is super, super powerful, because whenever you're playing a control deck, the fewer cards your opponent has in their hand, the easier it is to figure out what to do against them. That is sort of a maxim that goes all the way back to the control era of 1993 and 1994. Opponent with no cards in hand, very, very easy to contain with counterspells. Toxic Deluge. This is the best sweeper in all of Commander. I love this card. And again, because the life loss is so negligible in a 40 life format, and this is such compact casting cost, you can just crush every creature in play for 5 or 6 life and only 3 mana. And it bypasses regeneration too, unlike some other of the Wrath of God type effects, although obviously not Wrath of God itself, but it's so imminently castable. All of the other Wraths all cost 2 specific colored mana, and Deluge is just super, super cheap. You can just slip it around, counter magic and various other things like that. Love the card, and would not be without it in any deck with black. The Trinket Mage, another excellent creature in the deck, and I think the deck probably runs a total of about, I think it's like 6 or 7 guys. Trinket Mage, of course, exists primarily to fetch 2 cards, the Crypt and the Soul Ring, but it can also get, don't be afraid to get Opal or Diamond if the situation dictates that, if you need colored mana more, and of course you can also get Sensei's Divining Top, which is fantastic if you happen to have Future Sight in play. Veldican Shackles, absolutely one of my favorite cards, period, in Magic, and certainly in Commander. I love this card. It is at its shining best in Nin the Pain Artist, but of course works extremely well in Breya, and really in any deck that has a lot of islands, and can be copied and fetched and stuff, and just gives you incredible ability to dictate the pace of play on the battlefield. Being able to steal your opponent's commanders, or being able to steal one guy's creature to block another guy's creature, it just discourages people from attacking you. So much flexibility, and there's almost always a target to grab with it. You don't need very many islands. Even 2 or 3 is enough to steal most of the creatures that people play with, and to severely impact the board. Just maximum flexibility here in the form of Vindicate. Just destroy target permanent. It doesn't really get much better or flexible than that. And I think the card, even though it's sorcery speed, the flexibility of it overall to deal with any type of permanent more than makes up for it. Really, really excellent. Whir of Invention. This is one of the, I think this is the most contemporary card that's in the deck, printed very, very recently. And I love this card, not only for its ability to fetch Mana Crypt and Soul Ring for a relatively trivial cost. I mean, if you've got 3 islands in play, or 3 blue mana in play, it's effectively the same exact effect as Fabricate, only at instant speed. And of course it can scale and put bigger things into play, like instant speed Veldican Shackles. You can get Gilded Lotus, you can get the Divining Top or whatever. And there's another awesome extra ability attached to it. Because of this improvise thing, you actually tap artifacts as part of the casting cost, which means if you have Winter Orb in play, you can use Winter Orb to pay for the improvise cost. And that shuts off Winter Orb for your turn. So at the end of your opponent's turn, after they've grumbled and untapped 1 land and done nothing, at the end of their turn, you pay 3 blue, you tap the Winter Orb to improvise, and you get a full untap step and get an amazing artifact out of your deck as well. Whir of Invention is excellent, and you can tutor for it as well with various instant speed things. Yawgmoth's Will, super insane powerful card from Vintage. From Vintage era. I don't know if even know if it's legal in other formats besides Commander and in Vintage, but this card in mid-game does absolutely silly, ridiculous things. Things where you've sacrificed a bunch of artifacts to Breya. You cast Yawgmoth's Will and you regrow a billion artifacts out of the graveyard, like 5 or 6, and generate a ton of mana, and play 2 Planeswalkers and Swords of Plowshare, something in Tithe and Demonic Tutor, and just go on and on and on. You basically just win the game. Having Will in your deck is an extremely important tool to have, because you need to be able to have a regrowth type effect for things that are lost early on, especially certain key artifacts like the Crucible or Shackles and stuff like that, as well as the ability to regrow some of the Planeswalkers. Yawgmoth's Will is so strong. All right, moving on to 4 mana. We are almost done. Cryptic Command, even though it's got a very expensive blue mana casting cost, I think the overall flexibility of the card is insane. I would say that the most common thing I do with this card is bounce and draw. Often to bounce lands at the beginning of the game, and certainly it's a counter spell too, although I'd say Cryptic Command's best uses are probably not as a counter spell, because 4 mana counter spells are just kind of dubious. The flexibility of being able to just bounce permanents and often tap out your opponent's creatures and do things like that too. It just kind of does everything and is wonderful. Well worth the triple blue cost. Fact or Fiction is incredibly strong card drawing, can be fetched with the Merchant Scroll as well as with Mystical Teachings. And yeah, it's just one of those things. Be aware at your table of the guy at the table who seems like he's paying the least attention, or the guy who is maybe you have the best rapport with, to choose to make the Fact or Fiction selection, because often, obviously you want to select for the person that's going to give you the most advantageous choices as far as how they do the split. There'll often be a lot of table talk about the card, but you can usually figure out who's going to give you the best set of 3. Jace the Mind Sculptor. incredibly, incredibly ridiculous powerful Planeswalker. I would say the most universally strong Planeswalker in all of Commander. I don't think it's the best one in the multiplayer format. I think Tezzeret the Seeker is still better because it gets Mana Crypt and Sol Ring. But at the same time, Jace is cheaper and has just absurd abilities. I'm sure that, you know, books and books and books have been written about how ridiculous and grotesque Jace is. Can't really go wrong with him. Don't be afraid to use the +2 ability on Jace, though. The ability to Fate Seal your opponent. A lot of the time people will play him and immediately will go and start drawing cards with them and not really consider what their opponent might be having. A lot of the time I play Jace and I really consider about how likely it is my opponent might have some way of interacting with him when he has 3 counters. And so I'll often just Fate Seal with him right away. And keep in mind that Fate Seal works on you as well, and often it makes a lot more sense to Fate Seal yourself than to Fate Seal your opponent. Consider that that's scrying, for one, when you do it on yourself, and that's a pretty damn powerful ability that adds 2 counters to a Planeswalker. Mystical Teachings. This card is not played very often. I hardly ever see people use it, but I really, really love it in the Breya deck because of its sort of mid-game flexibility and the ability to go get 2 different instants. There's often situations where you do need 2 instants. You want to get a Tutor and a Sword, so you want to get a pair of counterspells or something else like that, and Mystical Teachings allows you to do that. And in fact, I find that I tutor for this card quite a bit in mid-game, which allows me to go and fetch 2 specific things. It does have a pretty high casting cost, but 4 is really not too bad by mid-game. Thran Dynamo, an incredibly powerful mana producer. It's like the Super Sol Ring. Obviously a lot harder to cast, but much easier if you draw Grim Monolith or Mana Vault or the Mishra's Workshop, or Sol Ring or Mana Crypt, of course. Thran Dynamo does stupid, silly things and allows you to chain cast Breya over and over and over again, as well as cast all the high-end bombs in the deck. Force of Will. Don't need to say too much about this card. It's kind of universally played in every single deck with blue. Completely changes how your opponent has to play against you if they're aware that you have it. And just having it in your hand is such a nice security blanket that can allow you to tap out and be more proactive in general. Super, super strong. Future Sight, another card you don't see very often, but I'm a huge fan of this card. I think people don't use it because of the blue casting cost, but it's really not that hard to get it into play, especially if you do hit Lotus or if you've got Coalition Relic or something. And once you've got Future Sight in play, if your opponents don't deal with it, you're going to win the game in short order. And that's especially true if you have access to Sensei's Divining Top, which I mentioned before. So I'll explain how that trick works real quick. Oh, that was very lucky. Let's put that there. All right, so if you have these 2 guys in play, the top says, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order. And that's already very handy with Future Sight, of course, because you can order the cards so that the top card is something useful. But even more importantly, this secondary ability is draw a card, then put Sensei's Divining Top on top of its owner's library. So imagine I have these 2 in play. Well, the top card of my library, let's say, is a counterspell. So I tap the top, I draw the counterspell into my hand, and the top goes on top of my library. Then I pay, because Future Sight allows you to play the top card of your library, I pay 1 mana, and I put the Divining Top right back into play. And now the top card of my library is a land, so I'll just put that into play for free. And the next card of my library is another land. Well, I don't want that there, so I'll tap the top again, put the land in my hand, top goes on top of my library, I pay another mana to put the top back into play. And so you can continuously just do that. As much superfluous colorless mana or colored mana as you have will generate 1 card off of the interaction of Sensei's Divining Top and Future Sight. And it gets even more ridiculous when you've got things like Thran Dynamo in play, or imagine with Mishra's Workshop. Literally, Mishra's Workshop, when you have these 2 cards in play, is tap to cast Ancestral Recall. It's that insane. Both cards work great by themselves, of course, but together they are super, super strong. And if you do have Future Sight in play and you draw a way to tutor for an artifact like Tezzeret the Seeker or something, then the stock of what's going on with my screen here? Sorry about that. Yikes, hopefully that wasn't going on for too long. Sorry about that. Sorry. Oops. Apologies, guys. This is what happens when you film with an iPhone. All right, anyway, if you have Future Sight in play, then the value of Divining Top goes through the roof, and it should be a very, very high priority to go fetch. Love Future Sight. Gilded Lotus, incredibly powerful, amazing mana fixer and mana accelerator. At its best, of course, when combined with Workshop and Thran Dynamo and Mana Vault, and of course the Grim Monolith, but pretty good all by itself too. You can often just play this card on turn 5 or turn 4, maybe off of one of the smaller accelerators, and it'll immediately defend itself because it enables counter magic, and you can just kind of ramp from there. And then of course there's dream draws like Workshop into Mana Vault, into Gilded Lotus, into Copy Artifact, into Jace the Mind Sculptor, and stuff like that, which are draws that I've actually had with this deck before, all on turn 1. Anyway, Gilded Lotus is great. I think another card that's really underplayed. Tezzeret the Seeker, the strongest Planeswalker in all of Commander, in my opinion, mainly because of his ability to fetch the degenerate artifacts, but also for his mid-range ability to get Winter Orb and Veldican Shackles and Crucible of Worlds. And of course, never discount that final ability. -5, artifacts you control become 5/5 artifact creatures until end of turn. I have had many games where I've basically had a Tezzeret sitting in play with 6 or 7 counters in play, and I kind of just hold my opponent's life in my hands. I've got upwards of 15 artifacts in play, including Breya and her 2 Thopters, and Tezzeret can just activate and nuke someone down instantly. And often you can get enough artifacts in play that you can activate Tezzeret's ultimate and kill 2 people at once. So it's a finisher, it fetches the strongest cards in the deck, it generates huge amounts of mana by untapping the big things like Gilded Lotus and Thran Dynamo. It's just really insane. Tezzeret is incredibly powerful card and an auto-include, I think, in just about any deck in multiplayer format that has access to those cheap artifacts. Treachery, amazing card, unfortunately banned in 1v1 Commander recently, although it makes sense just because they were doing their level best to reign in blue, which still actually hasn't happened. Blue is still the best by far. But yeah, Treachery is just ridiculous. It's steal your opponent's commander for free. That's really what it reads, and it has the flexibility to steal even bigger things. Card is so strong that you can often recover and reverse a completely impossible board position with it, where your opponent has something big and threatening in play. You steal their biggest thing, you untap and play your own general, and completely flip the board around for 5 mana. There's really not too many effects in the entire format that can do that, and having access to Treachery is really important. All right, the 6. There's only one. Teferi, Temporal Archmage. This is a guy I definitely do not recommend playing him in if you don't have access to Mana Crypt, Sol Ring, Mana Vault, and Grim Monolith, because you need to be able to... He really shines when you're able to cheat him and play off the back of one of those cheap artifacts, because the -1 ability is so insane and disgusting when you combine it with the mana-producing artifacts. In the absence of all those cheap degenerate artifacts, I think Teferi is just too hard to cast. He's too slow, and doesn't have a place in 1v1 Commander as a result of that. But in multiplayer, Teferi is instrumental to fighting off multiple people. When you have 3 or 4 big mana artifacts in play, Teferi basically gives you as much mana as the rest of the table combined, all by himself. And that flexibility allows you to tap out and do a bunch of stuff, and then untap all your mana to interact with your opponents on their turn. So incredibly strong, and if you don't have the need to untap stuff, of course, you also have card advantage built into him as well. He's just all around amazing. And speaking of amazing commanders, Karn Liberated. At the 7 mana spot, he is the most expensive single card that I'm playing with in the deck. I'm not using Ugin the Spirit Dragon or any of the upper end stuff. I think it just tops out at Karn. And Karn has all the crazy flexibility and just completely dominates the battlefield. It's the kind of thing that requires an answer from all of your opponents, and he's very good at defending himself. And you can often just sit behind Breya in a wall of Thopters and just use Karn Liberated to eat up all the threatening stuff at the table, as well as